All right, so let's begin. My name is Kęstutis. Probably haven't known me at all, so I'm just I'll introduce myself at first. So I'm a beekeeper from Lithuania, and in our beekeeping, we use at least in our apiary, we use a lot of queen caging, and I'll go through the how it's done and what's the reason behind doing that. And why I decided to make this presentation to UK beekeepers is because in Lithuania, I've also introduced these topics to various beekeepers, and I'm also running online meetings. And there's a great interest in this technology. So I'm thinking that it might be beneficial for you. Maybe you will adopt some of the techniques that we use. Of course, I must notice that the timing, it's it's going to be different because our climate is a little bit different than from UK's climate. But I suppose that some uh, adjusting could be done, and the system could be used also in the UK. So to begin the presentation, I will start with fat body, and it's essential to know what what the fat body is responsible for in honeybees' life, because there is a lot of behind caging. There's a lot of reasoning, especially for the accumulation of fat bodies. So let's go quickly through the fat body and its main functions. So the first function of fat body is for the growth of the honeybee, and and one essential part must not be forgotten, that honeybee accumulates its fat body in larval stage. So basically, when bees are feeding larvae, uh, then the honeybees accumulate the fat body. And if you dissect a larva, inside the white substance is the majority of it's fat body. So the only time when honeybee gets the fat body is in its larva stage. Later, it can a little bit increase its fat body content, but the majority of it comes from the larva. And if you consider what the bees are feeding, how they are producing royal jelly, it's basically from two components, like from two glands. One gland uses natural pollen, for example, or bee bread. Another gland uses the internal resources, that's the fat body. So basically, from these two glands, the royal jelly is produced. And when honeybees produce royal jelly, they use their own fat body resource. So for example, when new bee emerges, it has a lot of fat body accumulated because she got it from when she was a larva. So one thing that they use is for the growth. Another thing is storage and energy, nutrient mobilization. So a very simple example, if a bee is flying somewhere, gathering resources, for example, I know nectar, and she doesn't find anything, then when she's returning to the colony, if she doesn't have good fat body, good, well-developed fat body, then she doesn't have extra resource from where she could take the energy to have it and reach back and go back to the hive. So bees with good fat body, they tend to return more to colonies because they still have the energy accumulated in their fat body. Another point which is quite essential is that fat body can detoxify a little bit of pesticides. So it's, for example, let's consider it like, if we consider human, that's like liver, so they can a little bit detoxify substances. So in honeybees, that's pesticides. So that's quite essential. Another very essential point is that fat body is responsible for water loss. So when honeybees have good, well-developed and non-diminished fan body, it helps to produce, for example, the small, very thin wax layer on their bodies. And when there is enough fat body, then there is enough also of the wax layer on their bodies, and this thin wax layer prevents the honeybees from water loss, because it just doesn't let the water get evaporated. And basically, that's how they prevent dehydration. So that's very essential. When the fan body diminishes, the bees just die out of dehydration. Another essential part is that fan body is the second immune response from bees. If we consider immune response of bees, the first layer of immune response is their exoskeleton, so that the viruses cannot get inside of the honeybees. But once, if they get inside, it is the responsibility of fan body to neutralize the viruses or bacteria. So fan body has this immune function, and that's quite essential. Another key part is temperature regulation. So fan body is also responsible, as in our brains, we have like receptors for processing whether it's hot or cold, the temperature sensoring. This is done in the fan body in honeybees. So basically, if they have well-developed fan body and not used, then they can determine whether it's cold or hot. And that's especially important, for example, in wintering, if bees go into clusters, for example, and the outside ambient temperature is quite cold, the bees with well-developed fan bodies tend not to deviate from the cluster because they feel that it's colder outside and they don't leave the cluster. So it's noticed that when the bees don't have as well as good developed body as other bees, then they tend to leave and then they get frozen. So that's quite also essential. Another thing is, as we talked before, protein and fat synthesis. So basically, a lot of proteins are synthesized in the fat body, and also for royal jelly synthesis, fat body is also used. And another and the most essential part for the longevity of bees is vitellogenesis. And basically, honeybees live long and they have long longevity because they accumulate vitellogenin in their fat bodies. And when fat bodies are used, they cannot anymore accumulate this vitellogenin, and they just die sooner. So that's the part of fat body and what it does. So we can see that there's a lot of functions that fat body has, and essential part is for us to know that varroa mites feed on the fat body of honeybees. It's been, maybe you've probably known, a lot of previously it was considered that varroa mites feed on hemolymph of honeybees, but it's rather fat body. So we can see if the varroa mites feed on young larvae, they don't develop well, they cannot store enough energy, they cannot detoxify pesticides as good, they lose water, their immune function is worse, they cannot regulate temperature as well, they cannot synthesize and feed other bees as good as other with well-developed fat bodies, and there are shorter lived bees. So it is essential in our technology to keep, in any technology, in any beekeeping operation, to keep varroa mite levels as low as possible in order to preserve the fat body of honeybees. Okay, so another part is when the fat body diminishes. So for example, let's take winter bees, and the winter bees have very well developed fat body, and it's because they don't feed brood, they don't feed larvae, so they don't use up their fat bodies. Another key part is that when honeybees get into contact with brood pheromone, they also tend to diminish their fat bodies. And another thing is that good winter bees, which have well-developed fat bodies, also are bred without varroa mites. So we have to keep in mind these three things, which will prevent our bees from diminishing their fat body. All right, so let's start with summer caging because I always tend to start with that, not going into winter caging, because summer caging, the most uh, and the most vital part of it is for the preparation of good winter bees. So as we talked about varroa mites that they feed on fat body, and now we know what fat body does. So if we look at the graph, for example, and let's consider varroa mite population, if, for example, they're only treated uh, in the autumn. So the varroa population is something like that. It grows exponentially. And if we consider the amount of brood, for example, in the colony, it's something like that. And what happens, the winter bees are prepared somewhere here. When the brood rearing starts to diminish, starts to plummet, and then is the part, then is the timing when the winter bees are being produced naturally. And as we see, the varroa mite levels are here very high, and it's only the total amount of varroa mites. But if we looked at it from the perspective of ratio of broods and varroa mites, our ratio would go somewhere here. So the varroa level, the brood with varroa would be super high. It could reach even 30% of our brood could be infested with varroa mites. So that's very essential part uh, in our beekeeping to understand that we have to treat bees before the winter bee population is being produced, because we know that varroa mites feed on fat body. We know what fat body does, and if the winter bees don't have well-developed fat body, they don't have longevity and etc. etc. So what we do with summer caging, we cage the, for example, the queens, and what happens with varroa levels, we treat it somewhere, I don't know. In our case, we treat it in June, yeah. So our varroa levels go basically to zero, and they reach a little bit here. So you can see the contrast between not treating them in summer and treating them. It's completely different situation and completely different quality of bees. So let's look for the summer caging, what we should take into account. So yeah, so as we talked, and we see from this graph that the main reason is to prepare healthy and strong bees for the winter, because that's the most essential part for a good overwintering rates and strong colonies in the following spring. Caging should be done when there's plenty of brood. So we consider plenty of brood, I don't know, it depends on your type of frames, but if you look at dead end frames, that may be at least eight dead end frames of broods. It doesn't matter, it can be capped brood, it can be open brood, it doesn't matter, at least eight of the frames should be in the hive when we do this caging. Often there is more, but that's the minimum, bare minimum. Best time, it depends on your location. For us, it's mid-May. And how do we determine when it's the best time? So when we look at winter caging, after release of the queen from the winter cage, we count 45 days. So 45 days, that's two generations of honeybees, and the third is already on the way. So after 45 days, in our climate, queens start to prepare to swarm, but it might be different in your location. So other signs which can help us to find the exact time are 3 stages of swarming. So for example, the first stage of swarming is uh, the starting of drones. So when we see in our hives that bees start to raise drones, that should be the first sign that the bees are getting into swarming season. The second stage would be drones when they start to hatch, and we see in the hives, so we see that there are many drones hatching that we see on the frames. So that should be a signal that we now need to think about caging within something like 5 days. And the last stage of swarming is the queen cells. Queen cells, when we see queen cells, that's too late. We cannot afford for the bees to reach this stage, because if they reach queen cells, it's going to be hell. Like, we'll have to take care of the queen cells. So it's very precise art. Well, not precise when you get used to it, but at first, to distinguish between these two stages, we cannot let the bees reach the queen cell stage, but we cannot do it earlier than there are drones, because the colonies won't be as strong as they should be. So somewhere when you start seeing in the colonies drones, you can start thinking of summer caging already. And that's, of course, if you have other means to avoid swarming, that's okay. But recognizing these stages will help us to prevent swarming with queen caging. So how do we do that? So when we find ourselves in the second stage, that we find there is a lot of drones in the colonies, we have several options. We'll go through one of them. If you're interested, after the presentation, you can ask questions and we can go through other ways to do that. But the main way that we do that, it's the A. So, no, sorry, not A, B. So after 10 days, we form a nucleus colony, but not as conventionally formed with a new queen, but with an old queen. So let's look deeper into this concept. So for example, we have 0 day, day 0. That's when the drone, there are a lot of drones already in the colony. What we do is we cage the queen. The cages are something like that. It doesn't actually matter. We will talk a little bit later about the cages. So we cage the queen, and when we cage on the day 0 in the hive, we mark frames with open brood, the largest open brood, which is to be sealed. So for example, we mark the brood, which is 8 days old, You will see how it will help us. We mark it with anything, with marker. You can use something like wax or anything that suits you. After 10 days, what happens in the colony? There's no open brood anymore, no open brood. So it means that they can't raise any new queens of their own. So on the day then, let's consider that's the first position. So the first position, the second position, the place where the hive stands. So the same colony is standing here, but we make a nucleus colony with the old queen. Let's put old queen. Here goes the old queen, and it's released. And we also take the broods of the frames of brood, which we marked. So after 10 days, they will be 18 days old, the brood. So what happens on the 10th day? We release the queen in this colony, which has, we know, 18 days old brood. So the brood here hatches after 3 days when it reaches 21 day. Yeah. But the queen, which is released here, she starts laying and her brood will be only capped after 9 days. So it will be after 9 days. Yeah. So we have here from 3 to 9 days the gap. So we treat the colony on the day 14, we treat with oxalic acid on the day 14 because there's no sealed brood. So we have brood break. Well, not actually brood break, but we don't have any capped brood there anymore. So on the day 14 to 17, we just in these days we just treat with oxalic acid and we use dribble method. So personally, we use 2% aqueous solution and 10 milliliters per cm. And it works effectively, everything is good and doesn't affect honeybee health as much as solutions with sugar syrup. So here we have already no varroa mites in the colony, which has the queen. Of course, here goes a little bit of honey, of pollen, also, of honey, pollen, yeah, honey and brood, and that's it. But what should we do with this colony? In this colony, we have a lot of outside bees. The outside bees also from here, they leave to this colony, the outside bees. And here we have only young bees left. So young bees with the old queen, they don't swarm and the swarm prevention is done. So what happens here, we have several options. One of the option on the day 10, we introduce a queen cell. And yeah, one queen cell might be not efficient, the queen might die or something might happen. So introduce 2 queen cells. And how should we do that? So we put a queen excluder. For example, there are 2 brood chambers. So we put a queen excluder. And for this to work, there has to be 2 exits. So the entrance here, and there should be an entrance in the second box. We use like a hole and we just turn around the brood box so that there is an entrance from the behind. And here we put, yeah, as I mentioned, queen excluder. So in this case, we can put the 2 queen cells. You can put even 3 queen cells, depending on your colony size. So in this way, we will wait another 14 days. So on day 24, there will be already drones hatched, and there won't be any capped brood anymore. So on day 24, we go to check whether the queens mated from these queen cells, and we also treat with oxalic acid. So in this way, both colonies with the old queen and this colony are varroa free. You can treat however you want. It actually doesn't matter as long as it's effective and it works for you. So yeah, that's one way of doing that. Another way, if you don't want to risk of introducing queen cells, is to introduce just the queen. But we do that on the day 17th, because if we release the queen, she will start laying, and only here after 7 days, there won't be yet capped broods, but it will be already, the old brood will have hatched out. So we'll have also a brood break where we can treat the bees. So it just depends on how you do it. We do it mostly with queen cells. So it works for us. If you don't mind doing with queen cells, you can do that. If you don't want, you can just use mated queens, and that's it. All right. So yeah, we have now the effective control of varroa mites in the middle of the season. We also have prevention of swarming because we've put aside the old queen. That's no problem. The old queen will raise a lot of bees, and even though the colony here seems quite small, but it's, I don't know, it's end of, in our place it's end of May, so this colony develops very good until it's going to winter. It's preparing for wintering, so it really just grows, and we can sell this colony in the winter and already have or merge these colonies. It actually doesn't matter, but the main point is to make a colony with old queens so that it doesn't, that this colony doesn't swarm, and in this way we have 2 brood breaks where we can apply oxalic acid. So yeah, we have effective bromide control. Another thing, what happens with brood break is that there now are a lot of young bees. Yeah, young bees are hatching, but there's no new brood being, the queen isn't laying, so there is no new brood. So what happens, a lot of young bees accumulate in the hive, and when the queen is released, or when the new queens, for example, hatch, mates from the queen cells, in the hive there is a lot of young bees, and when new brood comes, the brood is very well nurtured. So a problem that might happen is, for example, in spring, when the queen is not caged and there is no brood break, the queen lays at very rapid rates, and there aren't enough bees to feed the brood well. So then when the brood is not fed well, the quality of the bees diminish, and we might even face some problems with fall brood and etc. So having this brood break in which lots of young bees accumulate, and then we release the queen, and the mass of the young bees feed this little proportion of brood, the brood is fed very well, and the quality of the bees is super high. So that's very important for wintering bees, so that we have mite-free bees and that we have well-developed bees. So the main reason for this caging in summer is to have very healthy and strong bees. Yeah, and we use small format queen cages because we cannot, we'll talk about big format queen cages, and we use small. This one is quite large, it's 23, sorry, it's 23 centimeters, and this doesn't really depend. This is also used for winter caging, but we can use something like 10 centimeters long queen cage, and it's put inside the comb because otherwise the bees will draw comb if we put it somewhere else. And it's actually quite important to have the right height and the right width so the bees don't build comb inside the cage. So we just cut out the comb. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit of brood, it really doesn't matter. And we put it somewhere, let's say 20-25 centimeters from the bottom of the hive. So it's not actually sitting on the bottom because it's colder there, and the queen might not survive. So it's somewhere 20-25 centimeters from the bottom, and we don't put her higher because if here's entrance, yeah. If we put it further away from the entrance, for example, wasps or other bees don't feel the queen's pheromone, and they start robbing the hive. So it's essential to put it not too far, but not too close to the entrance. Somewhere around 20-25 centimeters, that's quite okay. So yeah, that's pretty much it about summer caging. So if you'll have any questions, we can go through them a little bit later. And now we go into winter caging. So let's first talk about, maybe it won't be relevant in your location, but in our location that's quite relevant, and I suppose in UK it might be also quite relevant. So let's begin with considering what good wintering depends on. So first of all, it's a large number of healthy winter bees, with well-developed fan bodies. As we've seen what fan bodies does, that's very important. And the longer we wait, for example, in the season, and let the queens lay, the smaller amount of winter bees will enter and go for winter. So what that means, if the queen lays, yeah, the bees continue to rear the brood and they continue to be exposed to brood pheromone, and their lifespan just diminishes. So it's very important to stop the cycle of brood rearing early in the season, and we do that already in late July. So if we go back to this graph, we do queen caging somewhere, let's see here. That's when there is still quite a lot of brood. So if you consider the amount of brood, that should be around 6 dead ant frames full of brood, and it doesn't matter again whether it's capped brood or not capped brood. 6 frame is the bare minimum, because that's what we see. The brood, it's actually the winter bees that will hatch out, and they won't feed anymore any brood. They won't contact as much with the brood pheromone. Thus the fat body won't diminish, and they will have a long lifespan. And if we consider how long can the bee without rearing brood live, depending on various resources, various sources of information, it depends. But actually, the bee can live from 1 to 2 years without feeding brood, and after giving the brood, yeah, back to the bee, the function of the glands doesn't diminish, doesn't go away, and they can still feed the brood. So yeah, so one thing is that we don't let the bees rear a lot of brood in the autumn, because it really doesn't make any difference. It's, I mean, if they're, yeah, they just are doing that for some reason, but it's really no benefit for the colony. They don't make more winter bees because they're raising them, but rather diminishing the number of actual winter bees. Another thing is good quality food. So it depends, of course, on location. On your location, it might be not relevant if you have flying bees, like a little bit of flying during the winter. That might be not relevant. In our place, it's relevant because bees tend to don't have many days when they can fly in winter. Basically, they stay in the colony throughout the winter for a couple of months. So it's very essential to have good quality food, and that the food is low in minerals, so it doesn't congest their digestive system as much, and they don't start to so that their digestive system doesn't fill as quickly. And of course, another key part is to have sufficient food and low consumption. As bees start rearing brood, they have to consume more food stores, and this also ends up in their firstly in their digestive system. They use a lot of food, more food, and the digestive system gets filled quicker. And another thing is when they start rearing brood at winter, as we talked about, fat body, it starts to diminish, and the longevity of bees that are wintering start to decrease. So that's very essential. And as is absence of bromides, when bromides winter, they also feed on the fat bodies of honeybees. So it's essential to have no, or at least bare minimum of bromides going into winter. Yeah. So we'll talk how the queen cages help with these points. So for example, with the first point, it's very clear. We stop the broods at a certain point and there is no raising of the brood anymore. So there is quite a lot of well-fed bees going into winter. good quality food. So when we cage the queen, for example, for the winter, after 3 weeks, all the brood is has hatched out, and we can do whatever we want. So we can remove all the honey and replace it with sugar. So we will see how we do that. But we leave honeybees only on sugar syrup, no honey. We give the honey, which we collected from the hives in the fall, back in the spring when they can start flying. Yeah, so sufficient food and low consumption, that's also done with queen cages because the breeds aren't rearing brood and they have low consumption because they don't need to raise the temperature and feed the brood. And absence of bromide, so after 21 days of caging for the winter, we again treat with oxalic acid, and everything then is great because there is no bromides or bare minimum left in the columns. So we start caging around the end of July. And why so early? Uh, just for your notice, our last day of flying, it's somewhere, I guess, middle of October. So it's quite like 2-3 months from the end of the flying season. So why we do that so early? That's because there's still a lot of brood in the colonies. So as I mentioned before, there has to be at least 6 dead end frames of brood. So that there is enough honey, that there is enough winter bees going into the winter. And it actually doesn't make a difference whether they are a month older or a month younger. If they stay like for a month longer, a month shorter in the winter. So we just cage them at the end of July. Another thing is if the colony is weaker, we can still stimulate it and give more, for example, sugar syrup so that they raise a little bit more brood so that we know that the colony is strong going into the winter. Another factor for our place is that it can get colder, and if it gets colder later, we're not as happy to go into the brood nests when it's quite cold, so we do it while it's still good temperature. Also, another key factor is that we need to feed bees only after 3 weeks after caging. So that's going to be if we cage, for example, for a week at the end of July, then we can feed only after 3 weeks. So that will be, I don't know, 20th of August. So that has to be taken into account. And another essential part is that the bees which hatch out have to have their orientation flights so that it can go into the summer with empty stomachs and empty digestive system. And it takes 41 days from the laying of the egg until the bee goes outside. So it has to also be taken into account. Yeah, so that's why we tend to start it at the end of July. And how do we feed bees without robbing, without inducing robbing, and to save some time and to renew the nest? So if we consider, for example, here the day 0, yeah, we put, for example, the queen in the cage, and we wait 21 days. Wait 21 days, the brood hatches out. So here's first position, for example, here's second position. So on the day 21, we move the hive here to just a little bit away from where it was standing. We have here the queen caged. And over here we put, for example, a new chamber, which we brought, new super, which we brought, and we put, for example, 6 frames. You cannot put more than 6 frames. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but you put 6 frames, for example, 4 frames of wax foundation and, for example, 2 build combs. Because when we will feed the bees, they will actually build the comb. And what we do, we just take from this colony and put the queen cage here. And that's it. Here we have all the bees. So how do we transfer them without like rushing or something? We simply put a feeder here. I'll show you what type of feeder we use. It's very simple. We put a queen excluder here. Of course, we pour syrup here, we put, we put then the queen excluder, not the queen excluder, sorry. We put the bee escape here, bee escape, and we put the colony back on. So what happens, all the bees go through the bee escape, they end up in feeder, they take the sugar syrup and they go down to the nest and they find the queen there, they build a comb, and in this way, we don't need to actually do anything within the hive with frames. We don't need to brush anything. We don't need to like deal with bees, because the only thing that we have to do is transfer the queen cage, and everything else is done with bee escape. And why do we have to leave 6 frames? Maybe it might be irrelevant for your location, but in our location gets cold. And when it gets cold, the cluster forms, and the cluster doesn't care where the queen is placed. So therefore, we have to really we have to make the nest compact so that the cluster forms actually somewhere here on the queen cage, and the queen isn't left alone. And because if she's left alone, she will die. So therefore we have to have it really compact, and that's how we do it. If it doesn't get cold in your location, that might be irrelevant. You can just leave all the frames in and have the queen cage. Yep. We feed for 15 liters of syrup, 3.3 to 2 ratio. That's sufficient for us to go through the winter. And considering that we feed them, somewhere in middle of August, at the end of August, that's sufficient enough for them to go until April. So from mid August till April, they are left with 15 liters of syrup, and that's it. They are sufficient because they don't breed anymore. They don't raise any more brood nor in the autumn nor in the winter, so they're using less syrup. And after, it doesn't actually make a big difference, but after feeding or just before feeding, we treat the colonies with oxalic acid. And there are 2 ways. One way is to use sublimation, so that might be one way to do that. Another way is to use oxalic acid 2% aqueous solution. If you use sugar solution for the winter, when the bees cannot, they don't rear brood and they are congested in a place and they can't fly for a long time, there might be issues with colonies dying because it affects honeybee's digestive system, and she cannot like cope with sugar solution if you treat it with sugar solution. So we better choose 2% aqueous solution, 10 milliliters per seam, or then use just sublimation. Yeah, let's talk about the queen cage. It looks like that. Why it's like that? Let's see from the side of the hive. Let's see, no, maybe like that. Here we have a frame. Yeah. So what happens? We put here's entrance. We put the queen cage like that. And why like that? Because the cluster, if it forms at your location, but in our location forms, the cluster forms here and it goes all the way to the back. It travels like this. So it basically mimics the movement of the cluster. And in this way, the queen just travels with the bees all together, and that's no problem for her for overwintering. And as I mentioned, what type of feeders we use, so that's the type of feeder. It's basically any type of super. We put just a plastic bag in it. We put a little bit of, I don't know how it's called in English. This from clay, that's burnt clay. That's used for isolation a long time ago. And we put a little bit like this piece here, a wooden piece, and here a wooden piece, so that the bees have like direct path to the nest where the queen is in the cage, and so that they can access the syrup. Because if we wouldn't put this one, the syrup would push the bag against the wall and they couldn't access it. So it's very simple feeder. We use it, we love it. It's very simple, and yeah. Okay, and what do we do in spring? After orientation flights, we tend to, it depends when the orientation flights are. If everything is okay, and I mean, the weather is quite good, it's promising, we release the queens after 1 week after orientation flight. So why do we wait 1 week? So within that 1 week, all the bees that are not of high quality, they somehow survive the winter, but they actually aren't very well. They die out, and only strong bees are left. And only those strong bees will feed the brood, and therefore will have strong first generation of brood, not being fed with weak bees. So just before the release of the queen, we tidy up the nest. If there's some feces, I don't know, the bees got diarrhea or something, we changed the frames because there is no brood. We can do it. It doesn't matter the weather as much because there's no brood. So we do everything tidy up, put a little bit of honey back, which we collected in the autumn after taking out in the autumn, which we took out. And yeah, so that's how we like put back all the colony. And then we release the queen, and on the release of the queen, we again treat with oxalic acid. Since there is no brood, the effectiveness is very high, and we treat again with oxalic acid after a week. And why do we do that? Because when queens start laying and larva starts to form, yes, the eggs start to hatch into larva, the varroa mites start to get active, and they climb out of from the backs of the honeybees where they wintered, and they start being on the bodies of the bees and start preparing to go into the brood cells. And that's why we dribble again the oxalic acid. So we do that 2 times, but it's optional, because if we did that in autumn, there should be pretty low on overall mites already. And the main question I get is whether the queens start laying and whether they are good at laying. So they start when you release them, especially if there's already something blooming, then she's laying like from a machine gun. I mean, that's super crazy to watch how she starts to lay super fast and in large quantities. Yeah, so that's it. And another plus, if somebody will be interested, when we have the queens caged in the springtime, we can combine 2 colonies very simply into double queens. And for example, we here had 1 colony with a queen, we had queen caged, we have here another colony with queen caged. Just after the release of the queens, in the same evening, for example, we put on the stronger colony, we put a queen excluder, and we put a little bit weaker colony just directly on top, and that's it. In this way, we get the same bees, like the same bees go with 2 queens, and the queens, if 1 queen performs not as well, she will get replaced. So thus they are incentivized, and they have incentive to perform very well, and they perform better, because if one doesn't perform as well as another, she will get replaced. So in this way, we have 2 colonies working, 2 queens working in the same colony, and the results, the honey flow, the honey production, I don't know, whatever you collect, else pollen, royal jelly, I don't know, anything else, it's way better because there's more bees and they work very well. But just one thing you have to notice with this, with working with this, that you have to have two separate entrances facing different opposite directions. So as I told you earlier with the queen cells, here we have another entrance, another hole in the chamber, so that the bees can fly out there also. And here we have the main entrance. Otherwise, this queen will not survive, will get replaced. And basically that's it. If you want, we could elaborate more on this, but it's not the main point. So yeah, so after release, they start to work, and after 45 days, we again go back to the summer caging and we start the season again. So if we put it into summary, how our season looks, we put a time frame. So I'll talk about my dates. They can be different at your location. So we released them in April. Then we have here May. Here we have June, July, and August. And what happens? So here, let's consider a brood. The brood starts to be here. Then there is a brood break. Then the brood is reared again, and then there's another brood break. And if we consider varroa mites, here we have bare minimum levels. They start to a little bit rise. Then we control the varroa mites. Then they start a little bit to rise, and then we again control them. And that's it. And what we do here, the release. Here we cage. Here we also cage, and somewhere here we use oxalic acid. Here we use oxalic acid, and here we use oxalic acid. And it depends, you can use another time oxalic acid. And that's how our season looks, and we have no winter losses. And yeah, winter losses regarding varroa mites. Other winter losses can occur. It's also, but considering varroa mite losses, there's none. So yeah. So if there are any questions, I would welcome them. And another point I just forgot to mention, this presentation will be uploaded to YouTube, so you can rewatch it again if you're interested. Yeah, so if you want to increase honey flow product, the amount of cell honey, what you need to do is cage the queen 10 days before the anticipated honey flow. And because all the brood will be hatched and the bees won't be attending brood as much, so they can focus on honey flow. And actually we did last season, we did experiment with American beekeepers, and we tried to compare the effect of queen caging on honey flow. And basically in both cases, both in Lithuania and both in the US, it was in Ohio, the honey production increased quite significantly. There was a significant increase of honey. So yeah, 10 days before anticipated honey flow, that's the best time when you can cage the queen. But another thing that you must consider is between difference between caging of the queen, like when we cage the queen and then release her. After the release and next caging, there must be at least 45 days gap. So for example, here we cage the queen, sorry, cage the queen, release her, and here we cage again. The period has to be at least 45 days because that's the amount of time when generations hatch, and we need 2 generations in order to have enough bees which will be long-lived. So yeah, at least 45 days between releasing another caging. But it actually increases the flow. That's no question. Yeah. So do you cage queen from August to March? Yeah, from August to basically, and depending on the weather, April, so around 8 months. So yeah, our queen works in the hive somewhat like 3 months per year. Yeah, what's the difference? We had observation that was 20 kilos of honey for, but it depends, of course, on honey flow. In the US, it was 18 kilos difference. It depends on the place. 18, 8. But it also depends on the amount of brood. If we consider this method is coming from Ukraine, it's been practiced in Ukraine for, I don't know, maybe somewhat 50 years, and they are using it quite heavily also. And depending on the method, as I told you, like if you use double queens, you can get even more honey, and if you can engage them. Another way, if you have like mild honey flows, but then you can cage the queen, for example, at the end of, I don't know, in the end of, for example, May, before this swarming, and leave her until like, I don't know, for 2 months. But in this case, there won't be any brood, and the bees will collect as much honey as possible, and they won't use it for brood rearing. But it must be noted that there should be a lot of brood when we do that, and it should be combined like 3 colonies into one. Like there should be like lots of brood if we want to do that. Yeah, just reading the questions. Yeah. So Helen, that's actually a very good way also to do that. And this method is, as I recall, comes from Büchler, Ralph Büchler from Germany. Kirchhain, they use that. It's quite also nice method, yeah, not to use oxalic acid. But it depends on the operation. We operate with somewhat 100 colonies going into winter, so we just don't have time for doing that in each and every colony. Yeah. Yeah, so Demos, you could try. I know it depending on the honey flow, it might be irrelevant for you, or you might want to, I know, try combine several colonies into one and then just try caging the queen, like get a lot of brood in the colony. I know 20 frames of brood, like dead end frames of brood, and then cage the queen and leave the colony, I know, for 60 days. So it takes advantages of those small short honey flows throughout the season. It might be an option. Do we find the queens get superseded while it's caged? Some of them do. Some of them do, but actually what we have found and what Ukrainians have found, their scientists with which have been doing the queen caging for 50 years, is most of the time the queens that get superseded are lower quality. And that's actually what they do for quality assurance of queens. So if the queen is releasing too little pheromone, the bees just start superseding them. So one thing is not to keep all the queens. Another thing is it might be a good signal for you that the queen is of poor quality and should be replaced. But in our case, with summer cages, it happens like, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2% of the colonies do that. But with winter cages, we haven't had any issues yet with superseding. We've had issues with the queen cage. In one queen cage, the queen got stuck, but it's the problem of this queen excluder, because one queen got stuck into the between the parts, and yeah, she just died there. All right, so I will post. I've created new because I have my Lithuanian channel, but I won't post it there. So it's called Queen Caging. Sorry, Caging. You can find it. It's completely new because I created only for this purpose. So I will upload the video, I don't know, maybe today or tomorrow, depending. Yeah. So thank you everyone for participating, and hopefully it was something interesting and useful for you to consider for the upcoming season. Thank you and bye-bye.